sustainability in lighting. Today's event is organised by Recolight, the UK's leading compliance body for waste, electrical and electronic equipment regulations. I'm Ray Molony. I'm the editor of the Circular Lighting Report, more of which later, and I'm going to be your host for the next hour and a half. Now, today we're focusing on remanufacturing, which is the rebuilding, the reconditioning and the upgrading of used luminaires, which we expect to become a very sort of significant part of the lighting industry in coming years. Now, we have an excellent lineup of speakers today, as you can see. Our panel today are Tom Ruddell, who is the lead remanufacturing engineer at Egg Lighting. That's a job title we may be seeing more of in coming years. Emilio Hernandez, who is a lighting designer. He's the co-founder of Ström, the independent lighting design practice based in Sweden. And he's also a co-founder of the GreenLight Alliance. We also have Simon Fisher, director of FMark and the host of the Recolight workshops, which we'll come on to in a bit. Nigel Harvey, the CEO of Recolight. And finally, we have Kevin Stubbs, who's a technical sales manager at Luminelight. Today's agenda. First up is Tom. Now, Tom is going to discuss the compliance issues, the warranty issues we need to consider when it comes to a luminaire that's been reused and reconditioned. Emilio will explore the barriers to adoption of reused equipment, and he'll also suggest some possible ways of overcoming those barriers. Simon will update us on BS 8887, which is the BSI standard for remanufacturing. Nigel has been giving it a lot of thought and has been involved in a lot of discussions about how we can make reuse a reality. And he is including the key role of contractors, and he'll be sharing some of his insights and his thoughts with us about that topic. Kevin will explore how reviewing and refreshing stacks up against a straight new luminaire replacement. He'll also share his experience of a couple of real world projects. And after Kevin, I'll invite all the presenters to come back for our panel discussion about the various issues that are thrown up by the reuse of luminaires and remanufacturing. And of course, here we welcome your thoughts, your comments, and your questions. And today's session is being recorded, and it will in due course appear on the Recolight website as well, so you can listen again at your leisure. Now, you'll receive an email notification when it's available, so keep an eye out for that. The webinar will be an hour and a half. We'll finish at 12:30 p.m. Please put your questions in the questions box and your chat in the chat box. And I say this because I'll only be looking at the questions during the event. My colleague Suzanne, she's taking care of the chat. So if you've got any sort of technical questions about sound or any other issues about the event, please put them in there and Suzanne will do her best to assist you. Now, as I said, today is one of a series of webinars on this topic. In March, we had one on how to be a sustainable lighting manufacturer. In April, we looked at 6 luminaires that we think point to the future of a sustainable lighting industry. And both of those, you can listen to a replay on the Recolight website. Simply go to recolight.co.uk and follow the links. Now, the planned webinar on the 22nd of September is being replaced with an in-person conference and exhibition, which we're very excited about, and more of which in a little bit. Coming up on October the 20th, we will look at projects and how they can be informed by circular economy principles. So that is a date for your diary. Now, we also had a series of webinar programs in 2020 and 2021, and you can also watch all those on the Recolight website as well. You can fast forward to an individual presentation should you wish. There's loads of great content on those webinars, so I definitely recommend you take a look. There's a whole lot of good stuff there. Now, Circular Lighting Live is our major in-person event this year. It's a one-day conference and exhibition, and we believe it's the UK's first major event dedicated totally to sustainable lighting. It takes place at the Cavendish Conference Centre, London, which many of you may recall from the Lux days and the events we held there, and is on Thursday, the 22nd of September. So, excuse me. Now, we recently had some new speakers. Neil McLean will explore life cycle assessments for luminaires. Now, he's going to walk us through some of the key models that are causing a lot of confusion. There's a bit, as you know, a big landscape of acronyms and models and metrics out there. He's going to look at environmental product declarations, EPDs, the CIBSI's technical memorandum 65, TM 65. He look at PEP, eco passports, cradle to cradle, and product environmental footprints. We've also added architect Shailene Church and cradle to cradle pioneer Paul Capel, both of whom they currently advise lighting brands and other built environment specialists on their sustainable manufacturing strategies. So they do know about lighting, they know about luminaires, so it'd be great to get their particular insights. And all those speakers you see in front of you will be taking part in September. So really looking forward to that. And you can see the whole program at www.circularlighting.live. Now, a word on our sponsors. The event is being backed by some of the leading sustainable lighting brands in the business. The platinum sponsor is Signify. We have 2 gold sponsors, they're DW Windsor and Lucent Lighting, and Holophane is the silver sponsor. Now, it's supported by the ILP, the ECA, DEFRA, Build Back Better Awards, EFIX, A1 Lighting, The Light Review, and ARC Magazine. Now, on rates, if you book by the 29th of July, you can get a 50 quid discount off the standard rate. Better still, if you're a fee-based specifier, now whether that's a consulting engineer, an independent lighting designer, or an architect, you can attend for free. So you just go into the normal registration channels and you'll get an email confirmation of that. The event includes lunch, tea, coffee, refreshments all day, and a drinks reception in the evening, courtesy of Signify. So we look forward to seeing you in September. Now, our other big launch is a complimentary launch, I should say, is a circular lighting report, which is a guide to the latest developments in sustainable and circular lighting. Now, this is where you could learn about the people, the products, projects, and the processes that are shaping the industry's low carbon future. It includes explainers on the latest innovations, opinion pieces from thought leaders, video interviews with leading disruptors, and lots of other good stuff about sustainable lighting. You can navigate to that on recolight.co.uk/news, and also keep an eye out for it on the usual social media channels. Now, just a reminder about Recolight's one-day workshops on lighting product design for a circular economy, which are getting great feedback. They are in person. They are run by Simon Fisher, our speaker today, and he really sort of demystifies the process of moving towards a circular economy for a lighting manufacturer. So he goes through the circular economy standards and the specifications that companies can use to show the circularity of their products. And he also provides loads of practical guidance on design issues. The next one takes place on next week on the 14th of June in London. I'm going to be there. I'm really looking forward to it. And again, more details at recolight.co.uk. In some industry news this month, Tamlight says it has eradicated more than 51 tons of plastic from its operations over the last 4 years. Now, that's equivalent to over 1 million plastic bags. So well done to Tamlight. Now, the Midlands-based manufacturer has also reduced consumption of new plastics by 80%. That's down from 14.5 tons in 2020 to just under 3 tons. The move to eliminate plastics from its operations is part of the firm's circular economy strategy. Launched this month is a range of luminaires which are made from bio-epoxy resin, which is in turn manufactured using byproducts from the agricultural industry. Now, these Aura lights are the result of a collaboration between the British brand Established & Sons and the Rotterdam-based designer Sabine Marcellus. It consists of a range of 2 linear pendants made from cylindrical bars of the pastel-coloured resin, over 1 meter in length and coloured in soft tones. The translucent Aurora lights take their name from the warm glow they emit when illuminated. Now, you can see these and more stories about innovative new materials and processes at recolight.co.uk/news in the Circular Lighting Report. Finally, a reminder that the lighting category of the Build Back Better Awards is open for entries. The award celebrates innovation, creativity, social purpose, and environmental leadership in the built environment. And the closing date, final closing date for the lighting category is Friday, the 29th of July. Okay, turning to the business at hand, I'm going to hand over to Tom for his presentation on the compliance issues we need to consider when it comes to the reuse and reconditioning of luminaires. Tom.
Thanks, Ray. Yeah, so hi, my name is Tom. As Suzanne introduced, Ray introduced, I'm lead remanufacturer engineer at Egg Lighting. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be quite brief, and this is a massive topic, but hopefully we'll be able to explore some of the key points around compliance for remanufactured luminaires. Now, starting at the kind of high level, when a product is remanufactured, it will feature some reused or older components, some components which might have been remediated or modified in some way. The way in which that's carried out and the way in which compliance is assessed, evidenced, and demonstrated, the responsibility for that is on the remanufacturer. But the point at which a product is placed on the market, all of the same legislation which applies to a new product also applies to that remanufactured product. So I think that sets a clear kind of standard for the diligence that needs to go into the compliance process for a remanufactured product. And that includes updating all labeling, documentation, and various assessments. So I want to just quickly make the point that that compliance process, that starts at the very initiation of a project, when there's maybe early discussions with a client or a product is identified, an early compliance consideration needs to be made then, and it will need to carry through to the entire project, even to the end of the project, and checking and verifying performance after installation. Now, obviously, with remanufacture, there are critical differences to a traditional manufacturing process. For example, you might be dealing with smaller production quantities. You might be dealing with greater variety in product design and variety, or even variety in the condition of components. You'll ideally be looking to conduct non-destructive testing, and components that will be involved in the production might be lacking data sheets, or maybe quite old. So there is a degree of innovation required, new thinking perhaps in how we proceed. Next slide, please, Suzanne. So first things first, really, on electrical safety testing. Now I'm going to absolutely blitz through these different points, but electrical safety is obviously a core consideration in the compliance of luminaires. Now, there's distinction between type testing and product testing. So product testing being end-of-line checks, routine manufacturing checks on completed remanufactured luminaires, whereas type testing would be conducted on samples and is designed to check the compliance of that type, that engineering configuration. But obviously 100% of units need to be tested at the end of remanufacturing for electrical safety, and those records need to be kept. And I would probably point out that with remanufacture, individual products are more varied, and therefore the importance of keeping segregated records is more. Next slide, please. So thermal testing, particularly where you might not have CAD for every component or an in-depth understanding of the thermal properties of every component. The onus is on test methods. So some images here, you can use simulations, practical testing in a number of different ways. And obviously the application will inform the required test regime on that. So next slide, please. Now, photometric testing. I've included some images here of actually simulations, but obviously there's a two-pronged attack on this. So for emergency luminaires in particular, photometric information for a remanufactured product, as much as a new product, that's an essential requirement to be provided to a client. And on the other hand, photometrics can assist the client with checking that the lighting scheme, rather than the individual lighting product, meets various regulatory requirements. And that can be supplemented by on-site lux checks as well. So next slide. Eco-design, it sounds obvious when we're talking about circular economy, but it's important that when a product is remanufactured, the ability of others or yourself again to remanufacture that product in the future needs to be considered at the redesign stage. So for example, for us, we try and consider efficiency, we consider trying to use standardized components wherever possible, and also providing those publicly accessible instructions on maintenance. Next slide. Compliance, we don't need to get into really, although one point being that products which are being collected with the intention of remanufacture. In the WE world, that's considered as reuse or prepared for reuse, and that those products can be classed as used electrical and electronic equipment rather than waste. Next slide. Now, so on red, obviously, if a product contains equipment under that directive, compliance needs to be assessed. EMC is a particularly challenging one for remanufacturers where we're working with smaller production runs. The approach that we follow at EGG is to conduct EMC testing on a known component combination, and then to try and use that combination across multiple SKUs to sort of spread those EMC testing costs over more products. Next slide. So final comments there really is, I know this has been a whistle stop, but you know, remanufactured products, there's a complete onus on the remanufacturer to go through the same level of diligence as would be expected from a newly manufactured product. There will be differences required, but this isn't a check at the end. It's not a open the box up and see what's inside. It needs to be a diligent engineering process, but it's definitely achievable. And as you can see with the flow there, can end with a very well lit space and a fully compliant product. So that's all from me. And you can obviously ask me any more questions at the end. So I'll hand over now to Emilio.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Hi everyone, my name is Emilio. As Ray mentioned, I'm sort of talking in a GreenLight Alliance capacity today, where we focus on circular economy and lighting. Tom, you know, that professional remanufacturing is a really important factor in quality perception for clients in overcoming barriers in adopting circular economy principles, and those barriers are something I'd like to talk about briefly today. So this learning pit diagram here, sort of found this a while ago, nicely sums up my journey over the last 2 years of a deep dive into circular economy principles in lighting design. It can be a bit overwhelming, and this is a big barrier to adoption and you know, even discussion around circular economy with clients and how they perceive it. It's only a small portion, remember, of their overall sustainability commitments on a project at the moment. And we've been speaking with developers such as Savills, British Land, contractors such as ISG and Mace, and these all now have dedicated circular economy roles within their sustainability teams. So that shows some commitment to this route, but ultimately the things that we've sort of the feedback we're getting is the main barriers, other than quality, as we just mentioned, and that perception, are cost, program, and the key part of program is the logistical uncertainty into bringing circular economy into projects. So when we think about circular economy, we've got two sort of aspects to it. We've got, in the short term, we've got legacy products, and it's about avoiding this waste. So in 2021 alone, 108,000 tonnes of lighting was placed on the market within the UK, and that's only about 7% of that is recycled. Now, recycling is great, but it's not actually great when we're talking about circular economy. It's almost a last resort, and you know, even when we think about recycling, reuse, and how that embodied energy and that practical use of those components is lost. Recycling also covers energy recovery, which is, you know, incinerating plastics and things like that. So, you know, when we're establishing a business case in the short term for models and for products that are already on the market, it's easier to establish a case for remanufacturing. The product has some sort of perceived value, and this value can be you know, an aesthetic or being part of the identity of the space. So this luminaire is in Oslo Airport. This was refurbished. The program was accelerated partly due to COVID and the access that they had to the airport. But if we look at it, it ticks that key box in that it's a key part of the architecture of the building. But it also inherently allows for upgradability, ease of repair, durability, and these are really key principles in circular economy. Just next slide, please, Suzanne. That's it. And you can see that within this product, and the scale of it, makes this process a lot easier. But that's really key. So something that's sort of important to remember as well is it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. So long term, we need to change our processes. So we need to address the problem at its root, not just looking retroactively at things. And the way we're going to do this is establishing methods of assessing and measuring the circularity of products when we put them onto market. So things that the clients are looking for are ways of measuring this, and material transparency is key. So we're seeing a greater request for things like energy product declarations and the provenance of materials. So whether they're healthy materials, for example. We sort of, as a collective of manufacturers and lighting designers, we're working on a checklist ourselves, which is TM66 is one that the GreenLight lights have been involved in with the SLL. And also a real key moving forward in the long term is going to be product traceability. And Tom also mentioned, designing products now that also meet eco-design guidelines. And something which needs to be bottomed out fairly quickly is what kind of information we include and how we track the materials and the components that are inside products that we're putting on the market now, which mean that when we're looking to repurpose or redistribute products in the future, that we have a database and quick access to that, so it's not as piecemeal. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just on this slide, I just want to talk about what's going to tip the balance from linear to circular economy. And on the left-hand side here, we've got quite a few sort of components really that we need to address. So operational energy, at the moment, the standards still encourage new technology because in-use energy is the largest emissions factor. And we have a commodity attitude towards raw materials. Now, this is a learned behaviour that we've all had, but there's a lack of resource and life cycle consideration. We just assume that the materials are going to be there. There's lack of legislation, although that is changing, and guidance that we'll see shortly. The linear economy is a very streamlined process. It's had 100 years or so to refine itself. It's been optimized over time, but the race to the bottom, we feel, has been met. There's sort of, there's not as many emerging markets that we can go to. That the value, or not even the value, but the cost benefit of shipping products from abroad is that the sort of bottom's been met in that market. And there's also a lack of knowledge in terms of how to design for circularity. But also the viability of these economic models and the risk that are associated with them. So how are we going to address those? Well, operational change. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the energy grid mix is becoming cleaner. It's becoming decarbonised. And that will mean that the embodied energy within a product becomes a bigger proportion, a bigger factor of what we're looking to measure. And it becomes more key. In terms of raw material availability, well, we need to move quickly on this. One study published by the Visual Capitalist suggested that copper is going to be too energy intensive to extract by 2050. So we're going to be looking for urban mining, for looking at material that's already been produced but has been buried, or existing products that are on the market today. And other components within lighting, such as PCBs and the LED itself, represent a disproportionate amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So, although they're smaller in weight and size, we need to think about either, there's people looking at new ways of manufacturing PCBs, or even retrieving them so that they can be reused. And that's quite a sort of a key component in terms of how we respect and value the materials. In terms of standards and guidance, we have a few different ones coming into the market. So we've got right to repair, we've got British Standard 888-7, which Simon will be talking about shortly. Eco design regulations, the EU Commission has issued a circular economy action plan, which is releasing funding for smart cities, which again is encouraging developers to get on board with circular economy. And then there's the energy labelling directive. So we've got quite a few bits of guidance coming onto the market. And then next we have the infrastructure issue. So as I said, the linear economy process is very streamlined. Reverse logistics are probably the biggest problem. There's things like how you can get the products down and back to the factory without damaging them. So that's a huge part of it. We're seeing third-party maintenance and resell sort of businesses popping up now, which are vetted to work on different brands and different products. And that is the economy part of the circular economy. Those are the opportunities that are being seized. And also there's other benefits in having local supply chain. Repair centres can give better oversight, they can be more scalable, and you get more local service in that sense. So those things are starting to emerge now, and through the sort of the research over the last couple of years and speaking to the industry, that's something that we're noticing to address that. And then there's the product design aspect of it. We're seeing better consideration in terms of the understanding of modularity and remanufacture. The concept of fit and forget is I think been quite damaging to the lighting industry, because it just assumes that there's no relationship with the product once it's installed, and there's certainly no responsibility for it at the end of life. But it's something that we heard a lot to give confidence into this move towards a very reliable LED technology, but it's leaving us with a bit of a legacy problem. And lastly, then, to sort of address the lack of knowledge, we're seeing an increase in demand and specifications. So this can be from including circular economy criteria as designers in our specifications, so that manufacturers need to consider that ability to remanufacture in their luminaires. But we're also seeing certain developers using EPDs, so product declarations, as a ticket to play for tendering projects, and that means that it's a big potential cost increase for manufacturers to jump on that all at once, but it's going to encourage us to gravitate towards that. And then lastly, designers need to adapt the aesthetic. As lighting designers, we need to take responsibility and think about how designing for circularity over just pure aesthetic will impact our designs. And the education there from sessions that, as Ray mentioned, F-Mark have been doing and touring with Recolight, they're really key to that, for us to sort of understand what does and what doesn't make a difference to circular economy. So lastly, I'd just like to focus that, for too long, we have focused on price versus value of resources. And we need to consider products and materials in terms of their value and not just commodity prices. And that's the sort of main takeaway there. So thank you very much for that. That's about it from me. I'd like to hand over to Simon Fisher from F-Mark to talk about the BS888-7 standard update. Thank you.
Thanks, Emilio. I really recommend checking out GreenLight Alliance if you've not heard of them before. Emilio is one of the founders, and it's one of the first alliances that really covers a cross-disciplinary cross-section of manufacturers, installers, end users, specifiers, and it's really good to get that collective approach and really understand how we get lighting engagement across that entire value chain, and make sure that a light fitting at the end of its first life, we know what to do with it. I'm here to talk to you today. Hello, everybody, about BS 8887. It's a British standard that already exists. Actually, you can find it, stroke download it, stroke purchase it already, and it's a standard that has been adopted by a number of other industries, such as the automotive industry and white goods and some of the computer peripheral industries, as a process standard for how they remanufacture their particular products. And within lighting, we made the decision maybe a year ago to create a suffix of BS 8887 that was dedicated to lighting products and the remanufacture of lighting fixtures. So just by way of background, remanufacturing of lighting is not a new thing. For as long as I've been in lighting, then there's always been an element of manufacturing that has taken back products and done something else with them. You can see from this slide and their experience from a UK retailer that we've over the years helped transition from older mercury-filled fluorescent technology into more efficient fluorescent technology, and then in the 2000s through the 2010s we took them into an LED, the first generation of LEDs, and now we're looking into an LED for LED style replacement, because the efficacy has triggered the efficacy gains have triggered that. But in many cases we've found that for instance the carcass of a luminaire actually holds the ceiling up in some of these situations. So actually the ability to remove the entire fixture and replace it in its entirety is actually a physical impossibility. So the principle of remanufacturing is not new. What 8887 should be able to do in the future is put a process around the principle of remanufacturing, so that there is a clear and level playing field for manufacturers that adopt these principles. So actually, do we have a rosy picture at the moment? And you'll see this slide a couple of times, just in two different contexts throughout the course of this webinar. But if you look at this slide, at face value, then recycling is in a reasonably good position. You can see here that of a cross section of recycled products, then a significant chunk of that is recovered or it's waste to energy. Emilio pointed out in the previous slide that the challenge with this is that only 7% of all lighting fixtures actually are kind of subjected to this kind of recycling. And ultimately, next slide please, Suzanne. Ultimately, recycling should be the final destination for a light fitting that has multiple stops in its journey, and we have to move away from this idea that a light fitting is a single use product that immediately is recycled at the end of its first life. And when we look at remanufacturing, then we're talking about how we keep the fixture, its materials, and some of its carbon in the system, so that we avoid creating new carbon moving forwards. Now, why is avoiding new carbon important? Well, we've seen legislation, and we are seeing more and more alignment to the requirements to quantify the energy and the carbon that has been generated to create light fittings, whether that's through the life cycle assessment process at UK level. That's kind of identified through the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers and the TM65 process. There's a dedicated lighting element within that carbon calculation of a built environment. And at European level, we've just very recently seen Lighting Europe align themselves to the PEP Eco Passport, or the PEP Association, for the generation of a kind of hopefully a fast-track, streamlined, cost-effective life cycle analysis for lighting fixtures. Now, why people are doing that is because ultimately we're going to get taxed on the amount of carbon that we state we use. There is already carbon emission tax draft documentation that is out for consultation now, which will inevitably result in the need for our carbon consumption to be validated and to be published, and you'll be taxed against that. So we can begin to see that where Emilio talked about this kind of price versus value, we're going to begin to see that there are going to be other metrics that are going to have quite a substantial impact on bottom line. And carbon taxation is going to form an element of that. We've seen at a European level that the European Commission are generating something called CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And what we're trying to do there is close the loopholes for effectively kind of fudging the carbon, your stated carbon by mainly kind of manufacturing products in a geographic location that maybe doesn't quantify their carbon emissions as well as the country that you're in at the moment. So loopholes are being closed, carbon taxation is coming. How do we make remanufacturing mainstream? Well, at the moment, Tom and guys at people like the Regen Initiative are having quite a tough time because, historically, light fittings have been designed for single use. As we transition into a sustainable environment and we embrace circular economy principles, then the process of being able to collect a light fitting in the future and do something with it is going to become infinitely easier to do because we're designing for a circular economy now. The European Commission came up with a statistic that said that 80% of the environmental impact of a lighting fixture is derived in its design phase. That's significantly lower at the moment if you're taking a historic light fitting out of the ceiling and trying to do something with it. But as we move forward, maybe from 2020 onwards, we should be able to take a light fitting out of the ceiling in the future, identify really easily how and what can be done to this to recondition it, repair it, upgrade it, remanufacture it, and put it back onto the market in a much more cost-effective and a much more expedient way. So to talk to BS 8887 directly, then this is a standard that we've been working on for about a year. I've been told by BSI that whenever we do get together that we're actually delivering this in a very expedient and a very fast fashion. I don't think it can come quick enough, but we're traveling as fast as we possibly can with it. Quite a number of contributors to today's webinar are also on the task force that have taken on board the task of actually drafting this standard. It is a process standard, and it will define for lighting manufacturers the method of taking receipt of, how to remanufacture, and the key criteria for then being able to replace that light fitting back onto the market. So the process will be defined. Principally, it's going to be a discussion and the process is going to be around risk management and risk assessment. But the aim of BS 8887 is to deliver some form of consistency to the specification market, to the end user, to know that when they're specifying products, if they're asking it, to make sure that it's been designed and remanufactured in association with BS 8887, that actually there will be a minimum baseline of, you know, compliance, of consistency, of repeatability, that has been embedded within that remanufactured product. A snapshot. This is actually we're actually meeting tomorrow, hopefully, to define the last draft before it gets formally submitted to the BSI editorial team. But to give you a snapshot and example, you know, this is a process flow chart that you know, may be subject to change, but it gives you an idea of you know, the assessment method that will help manufacturers define what they do with the light fitting that comes back. And maybe you'll notice on here that you know, the process of remanufacture doesn't just cover the fact that something can be picked up, have something done to it, and then put back onto the market again. There are actual two or three other credible alternatives to this assessment, and one is it's in perfectly good condition to be replaced onto the market again, and equally, you know, this thing is absolutely at the end of its life, and actually, if possible, harvest some components, but ultimately this is actually now, this has run its course and it goes into the recycling route via the WE directive. So why this is important is because we're all on a drive to net zero. COP26, and one of the big outcomes of COP26 is that, you know, everyone's going to have to start creating and publishing their plans for carbon reduction. You heard earlier in my slides that we're going to start taxed on carbon use, and you know, things like BS 8887 are going to be a real enabler to quantifying and enabling remanufacturing to become something that is a more mainstream than the kind of little cottage sideshow to new luminaire manufacture at the moment. So thank you for that. That's my time done. I'm going to pass you on to Nigel.
Thank you very much, Simon. And personally, I'm really looking forward to seeing BS 8887 completed, because I think it really will help specifiers and end users have confidence that the products they are buying, if they are remanufactured, are actually done to an appropriate standard. So I'm going to be moving on, talking about some of the nuts and bolts of reuse of lighting equipment and how we get product back into a remanufacturer. So if you can move on to the next slide, please, Suzanne, thank you. We're probably all aware of this, this concept of the waste hierarchy, and that is that the best thing of all is just to prevent waste from arising in the first place. If you can't do that, you reuse product. If you can't do that, you repair it. If you can't do that, you recycle it, recover energy for it, or finally just dispose of it. And it's really important to be clear that reuse and repair should always be considered first. Recycling is often not the best option. And you might think that sounds a bit strange coming from myself working with Recolight. And obviously we are a recycling and we compliance scheme, but at the same time, this is just fact. You know, repair and reuse are better. And so what, for a better environmental outcome, we want to try to reduce the amount that we're recycling and encourage greater repair and reuse. And in fact, we're optimistic that the WE regulations are going to be changed in the next couple of years or so to facilitate and encourage and reward that for manufacturers that get involved in more repair and reuse. And one of the problems is that, sorry, could you go back a moment, Suzanne, please, is that recycling destroys value. as we've heard already, you lose so much of the embedded carbon in the products, and because recycling basically ultimately chops the product up into little bits, and then seeks to push that back into the supply chain of new commodities, but then you're remanufacturing a whole new product, all the extra energy involved in that. And in fact, the plastics recycled will often cause, will often be, not always, but often be incinerated, causing CO2 emissions. That's driving the climate crisis as well. So moving on, please. And Simon has presented this to you already. I'll just talk through one area, and that is the waste to energy that you see there. So there's about 84% of typical luminaires can be recovered and go back into new commodities, but nearly 15% is actually going for as waste to energy. Inevitably, that at the moment means incineration, and incineration is causing carbon emissions. And so it's doing exactly the same as burning gas, burning diesel, burning petrol. It's generating CO2, and so making the climate crisis worse. So recycling is not the best option. Reuse is a better option. Thank you very much, Suzanne. So let's have a look a bit at the scale of the problem. Recolight as a scheme collects somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 tonnes of light fittings and lanterns each year. Many of those are fluorescent or sodium, old technologies, and include significant quantities of street lighting at the moment. But there are already some LED fittings coming through. And we're involved in many large-scale projects as our members are involved in rollouts of new LED products to retailers, to banking organizations and others. And what that means in those projects is you're getting large numbers of identical fittings being removed at the same time. Now, the sad truth is that currently virtually none are reused or remanufactured, and many are in very good condition before removal. And if we accept that much of the value is going to be destroyed by recycling, then surely there must be an opportunity to change that and change the system. Next slide, thank you. So Recolight, we've launched a pre-used lighting service. And what we're trying to do is to collect better data on product that is going to be removed during Recolight member projects. So we will be told that, let's say, there's going to be 100 retail outlets that are going to have new LED fittings installed over the next 3-6 months, whatever it might be. What we're trying to do is to collect as much information about the products coming out as possible, and often a salesperson will have gone in there and made a good assessment of what's in there already, because they need that before they specify the new product. So hopefully we can get some reasonable information about that, and then identify those that are reusable or capable of being reused. And we think that a minimum is probably at least 100 to 200 identical fittings, and hopefully much more, because some of those costs that Tom was talking about in terms of compliance are material. And so the larger the number of products that are going to be remanufactured, the lower the unit costs of that compliance is. So then what we want to do is to provide that data to potential remanufacturers, and including the original producer, because very often it's the original manufacturer of the product who is best placed to be able to remanufacture it. They know what went into it, they know the specifications, and they will have much test and compliance data already. So they may well be the best organization to remanufacture as well as manufacture. And our service will then be to deliver those fittings free of charge to a remanufacturer based in the UK. We would obviously finance the transport to a recycler, so it makes logical sense for us to finance the transport to a remanufacturer. And at that point, then the remanufacturer takes ownership and responsibility for the product thereafter, including compliance along the lines that Tom mentioned. Absolutely critical to the success of this, though, is the role of contractors. And there are a number of areas in which their involvement and their commitment and their support will make the difference between a project that's going to work and a project that may not work, unfortunately. And first of all, it's about removal of fittings. And really, we need to ensure that fittings are removed as though they were intended for reinstallation. That means using appropriate tools, not using hammers and chisels, but screwdrivers, etc. And obviously no dropping of product. If you're taking product out at a height, it needs to be taken down and placed on the floor, because obviously any damage that is caused to that used product makes it so much harder for the remanufacturer to produce a product that can then be resold. But it doesn't stop there. There's also packaging and storage. So we will supply contractors with cardboard bubble wrap, which can be used to wrap the products to try to prevent damage during transport. And the fittings should then be palletized and shrink wrapped and stored indoors as well. It would seem obvious, but it's an important point, because obviously a lot of waste is stored outdoors. This is not to be regarded as waste, and so should be stored indoors so that it can be, so that it's not damaged by water. And importantly, the product shouldn't be classified as waste. And Tom touched on this. It's quite an important point. But under Environment Agency and other similar organisations' guidance, if product is being removed and there is a reasonable expectation that that is going to be reused, then it is appropriate to regard it as used electrical equipment and not as waste electrical equipment. And the moment you classify it as waste, you create a lot of extra requirements that make it, unfortunately, rather harder to reuse. So don't classify it as waste if the intention is that it's going to be reused. And so that means that when it's transported, there is no need for a hazardous waste consignment note, for example. So clearly, contractors are critical in delivering all of this. And so at Recolight, we want to help to reward and recognize those contractors that do go above and beyond. And we'll be issuing certificates of circularity excellence to contractors who take part in this type of approach and who are successful in helping us to deliver a reusable product to a remanufacturer. So making it happen, we're reviewing every new project for suitability, but we do need more companies willing to remanufacture product, and we need more companies who are willing to receive back their own brand. So do please get in contact with us if you feel you're able to help in either of those. And it may be that actually that there are companies that consider the best way of providing a reuse service is actually to do it on site even and not involve us at all. That's great. If companies would like to get involved and be told that their product is coming out, but actually to find a way of upgrading it on site, that's perfect. So is this an impossible task? And it really is. It's challenging, and it certainly does require a mindset change. It will probably only work in a minority of cases. There will still be a significant proportion, even in the best scenarios, of new product being sold and still product going to recycling. We are undoubtedly going to make mistakes along with our partners, but we're going to learn from those mistakes and try to do things better and work smarter. And goodwill and support really is essential, and it does involve a number of different stakeholders to try to make this happen. And it does require a systemic change in our sector, and so that adoption is right across all stakeholder groups. It's end users and specifiers, and that the end user means not just the end user who might specify and purchase remanufactured product, but it's also the end users that are currently own product that is going to be taken out with their support, encouraging that product to be handled by the contractor in a more careful way, it is really important, really helps to drive the whole process. Manufacturers and remanufacturers are clearly important, and as we've said already, electrical contractors. And I think increasingly we're going to see within the industry remanufacture regarded as a business opportunity, and this is already starting with a small number of companies, but it's going to grow. And manufacturers may be doing this. They may appoint other subcontractors to work on their behalf. It could be that lighting and facilities maintenance companies actually see the opportunity to start delivering this type of service. And obviously that's dependent on end users and specifiers starting to specify it. So there is a real circular nature to the need to drive this forward. And education is essential, and hopefully this series of webinars is part of that process. Okay. So thank you very much. Very pleased to run through that briefly, and I'm now delighted to be able to hand over to Kevin Stubbs of LumaLight, talking about their approach to remanufacture. Over to you, Kevin.
Thank you, Nigel. Yes, I'd just like to explain that LumaLight is a company that's been doing this sort of thing for 30 years, not only as a luminaire manufacturer and remanufacturer and repairer, also dealing with controls and also dealing with the contracting element, which is a big missing link, this reverse logistics and dealing with people. So today I'd just like to run through a few things. That's obviously one big question is everything repairable? Well, the answer pretty much is everything is repairable. If you've seen the Apollo 13 film, people have said that failure is not an option, we've got to get those astronauts back. Then with the equipment they've got, they managed to do it. And in most cases, most things can be repaired if they're essential. And I worked in the Royal Naval Reserve as an engineer, and if something had to be fixed on a ship, you might have to cut something off somewhere and weld it onto something else, but you could make it work. When you come to having more time or the particular inclination or interest to do something, my hobby is jukeboxes, and keeping a 55-year-old jukebox going is A, interesting, but B, the fact it was designed in the first place to be repairable and maintained by a service engineer on site means that it is repairable, compared to, obviously, you could get a lot more tracks into a smartphone nowadays, but that's not very easily repairable. So can things be repaired economically? Well, that's our question. It depends on really what is the motivation and the drivers. We've all talked about costs here today, but the big issue is that particularly the project or the company that you're dealing with, or even the individuals, might have further needs and further wishes, the desire to literally fix what's done or to literally improve what they've got. Next slide, please, Suzanne. So the various drivers as to how we make the best use of our resources within lighting are like these bubbles that rise above each other, and the bubbles change position. Some rise faster than others at different times. The balance of all this information helps you to take the choice whether you should go through a review process and whether you should repair and at the last resort recycle and replace luminaires or any other product. But this is very pertinent to luminaires. It's dependent on the perceived need to the client, to the users, and of the project. There's a groundswell, as we know, of social awareness regarding the environmental needs, but obviously there's international, government, corporate, marketplace backings, as well as professional and individual levels. So in essence, it's a desire-driven thing that's supported by legislation and obviously supported by cost. Next slide, please, Suzanne. So when we're considering this and taking a decision process, whether we should review or whether we should reuse or replace, the purpose and the performance of what is there is the first thing we should perhaps consider, and also what might improve both the quality of the lighting scheme and the efficiency. And the existing limitations, and if there's any special or heritage requirements on a project, again, a heritage thing can make things particularly more complicated. Making sure that it's safe, suitable and sustainable has been talked about throughout this process for a product level, but actually we've got to make sure the building is safe, suitable and sustainable. And that if we're just changing the emergency lighting one for one, have we actually checked that the fire risks are still the same as when the building was built years before? So this is part of the process. Safety considerations include the CDM part of the obligations of somebody working on site. And so I suggest people take this sort of review, and whether you refresh or replace your lighting, it's got to be part of the decision. The worst thing is that basically more haste equals more waste, and the more haste when a building was originally built, the more corners that were cut, then they're going to use too much energy through life. And it also means, regrettably, they're either going to create more waste more quickly through their lifetime. So the poor FM people and clients might have that to deal with if things have been VE'd earlier up the chain. Thank you. So whether we reuse or replace, taking this case study example, this particular project was a historic England listed building in London. We found it had contemporary style rectangular fluorescent, in this case some wall lights, that had been fitted in a stairwell. They'd been fitted about 18 years before as part of a refreshment of the entire building, because it had been repurposed into a more modern day office. And that was also listed, that work, along with the original listing of the building. So we had to deal with different sizes of luminaires, a mix of fluorescent luminaires, and indeed some of those luminaires had already been converted to early LED generations, which were not very visually interesting. And certainly there was a lot of failing control gear and emergency batteries, which had gone way beyond their end of life. So as we were a contractor as well as a manufacturer, we were able to conduct an intrusive survey during a mock-up. An intrusive survey might be required, as Simon said earlier, if you know, even checking that your luminaires can be removed from the ceiling. This is a practicality, part of many other things, as well as reusing the wiring, etc. On this job, we found that there was some existing wiring problems, so we had to deal with that and talk to the client about it. But reuse was the obvious choice, and we did this by repairing a combination of off-site and on-site remanufacture. So we came up with a one-piece gear tray solution, which made the work on site as easy as possible. It helped overcome issues with the existing wiring being damaged and overheated. It improved efficiency dramatically, and obviously used the latest equipment. So we chose to use new LED light sources, modern controls, dimmable drivers, and detectors were added for the lighting controls, because originally these were never turned off and they were on switches that basically people just left them on all the time. Through this project, we made in the end 60% savings to the maximum load. When you consider we also added controls, it moved to well over 75%, even though there was very little daylight in those places. And this work being done just before COVID meant they probably saved 90 to 95% of their energy when there was nobody in the building. Whereas before that, they would have been using all of their energy because they'd have had the lights turned on just in case the security guard walked around the stairs. This is the project completed, and part of our on-site works include a thorough clean and the upgrading of the diffusing materials on site without risking damaging and transporting the carcass of the luminaire, and without taking down the luminaire and affecting the installation and the finishes of the area. Our own project management team and installing contractors removed the old waste. We transported it ourselves because we're registered carriers, as part of the return journey, and we stripped the equipment and recycled it ourselves. If we move on to the next slide, please, Suzanne. And then quickly on to a second case study. This is a typical office, which at first glance is typical London office. Everything looks okay. On this particular project, I was asked to comment on basically on a luminaire, actually, from a picture that they had. My client had already worked on one project. He said, "I've got this project in London," and actually I was able to tell him what project it was by knowing the luminaire. We went back to this project for them, and we were able to survey, and basically their lighting was being stuck on, and the controls weren't working properly because of the fact that the luminaires were designed of a very high standard originally, with good quality equipment and leading edge technologies. Then that meant the luminaire was fairly efficient, albeit not dimmable. But the controls on the building, again, were very flexible. It was all designed in, but the practicalities of how people work in buildings is what caused this building to not perform. So because even this client had numerous refurbishments, they'd ended up making their own lighting controls not work, making it not meet the fire escape plans of their own risk assessments. And basically lights were coming on at odd times, even if they knew how to turn them off, which they didn't because they'd not been trained. Then they were coming on at odd times. So doing some survey work, some simple work, we were able to find that, in fact, the luminaires are being triggered on by light switches elsewhere in the building. So that, along with many other things, we reconfigured the controls, and we chose on this job to literally repair everything, make sure that all the equipment was still working. That involved changing a couple of detectors that someone had damaged, changing a couple of switches, making sure that where there were switches behind, believe it or not, behind furniture, behind cupboards, etc., that they were either made to work, moved, or disabled. And just doing this simple review part really meant they could save 50% of their energy just by reviewing and servicing. So we didn't actually change luminaires on here, but they still save 50% of their energy. So it just goes to show that if you think outside the box, not only can we improve the luminaires, but we can improve the whole scenario for people. So that concludes my section. I'd like now to hand over to Ray, where we're moving on to panel discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kevin. Very interesting to see some real world examples there. If I can invite everybody to turn your mics on and cameras on. Fortunately, Emilio's had to go off to another engagement. We'd like to thank him for his presentation. Very interesting. Let's take some questions and comments. Simone Rossi is asking, to what extent will manufacturers be happy to take back product, and how is this going to be beneficial to the environment? Large players in lighting are transnational. They have very few manufacturing facilities across the globe supplying to different countries. Them taking back products would imply increasing carbon emissions associated with to collect end-of-life products and ship them back to plants. So, I mean, in our minds, we think about, you know, say in the UK, we have a local manufacturer takes back their products. They do. I mean, so Nigel, if I come to you first, when you have and somebody who has a factory in China, you know, bringing it into, say, the UK, and then, you know, so how do you see that working for the bigger players?
I think where the product is made in China, then obviously but the company is keen to get involved in remanufacturing, so the better approach is to use a local subcontractor, appoint an organization that has the competence, which can receive the training to make sure do the thing right. But I think one of the consequences of moving towards more circular economy principles actually will be a shortening of supply chains. It's going to become more sensible to manufacture closer to the place where product is put into service. And it's worth pointing out that distance issue is actually captured in TM66, that the further away products are made, the lower your TM66 score.
Tom,
Just-
do you,
yeah,
do you on this?
yeah, thanks, Ray. So I won't comment on the whole question, but on the point about emissions from transportation, this is something which clients often bring up, and it's fantastic that people are, you know, really demonstrating that they're considering life cycle environmental impacts. When we use the CIBC TM65 methodology, so we're trying to measure contributors to embodied carbon throughout the remanufacturing process, and I would say it's a common misconception where there is even 100 miles perhaps, or even slightly more, of road transportation of luminaires. It's surprising how little that contributes to the overall embodied carbon of the luminaire when it's remanufactured. And the best antidote to those sources of confusion, which are valid questions, is just for a greater publication and uptake of those sort of scientific based calculation methods. So you know, I think probably multiple people on this call would be able to provide that information for a project that they'd be conducting. So yeah, actually the transportation is less important than you might think.
It does feel quite. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, Ray. You can't escape the fact that as an industry over the last, let's say, 15 years, the vast majority of manufacturers have taken advantage in one way or another of a global marketplace, right? And some of the economies that brings from a value perspective. Now, unpicking that through the remanufacturing process, it does create some problems, particularly when, you know, not just China, but if the OEM, the incumbent OEM is from Europe or from the US or from anywhere, you know, engaging with them, you know, maybe to remanufacture 100 light fittings is probably not likely to happen. And that's where guys like Airgun, where Kevin and Regen Initiative and a number of others can step in to kind of pick that piece up, hopefully with kind of endorsement or recognition from the original manufacturer that we can do that piece of work. But, you know, maybe not.
But perhaps this is going to drive a need for some more partnerships with specialists who perhaps are more local and can do the work more conveniently in collaboration or on behalf of, you know, or with the manufacturer. But as Simon said, a lot of luminaires have gradually moved to be less recyclable, and very clearly in my career, it's gone from some particular projects that I know I've revisited myself 3 times at least in their lifetime, to now some buildings, some luminaires are put in there that might not last 3 years, and people don't necessarily realise that they're doing it when they've done a cheap energy refurbishment.
Just to pick up on the sort of subcontract point, a contracted remanufacture is quite a well-established process in other industries, and that's something that we've come across with in BS 888-7. We're trying to make explicit reference to that as one of the many remanufacture pathways that products might go through, and to try and support those relationships between the OEM of the original product, who has a stake but maybe isn't able to, or it's not part of their business model to remanufacture that product in-house. So yeah.
Tom, just on that point, you've said in the past, you know, there's not this massive money tree in remanufacturing. And how does it work if you're getting, you know, a subcontractor going to a manufacturer there where everybody's adding a margin? How do we make this so that it works as a business model for everybody?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one key point is that we should be looking at life cycle costing, because focus on upfront costing, you know, we understand why it happens, but it does miss longer term expenses, which a client will incur. And obviously, you know, in general, where we've got higher quality base fittings, that does enable remanufacture, and it does actually enable the client to save money in the longer term by having a product where maybe key components need to be replaced, but the base fitting can be retained for a much longer period. And And also, I think, it's that point about designing products for remanufacture, which obviously Simon's running a training course on. I think that would be a key thing where we've got standardized components or products where the disassembly and remanufacture of that product at its end of life is considered at the start of its life. That really helps reduce some of the labor and the cost in the remanufacture process. Yeah. And to be honest as well, at this, sort of nascent period for the remanufacturing industry and lighting anyway, it's going to appeal to clients who value those benefits, and perhaps are willing, for that to be an equal consideration to price savings, because ultimately that you can always buy a cheaper product, can't you?
I was speaking to Joel Snedberg in Brighton, and he's saying, he's had examples of clients in Sweden willing to pay more for a reused product. I don't know whether we're not quite in that position yet.
Yeah, I mean, we can find ourselves in a situation. I mean, a couple of things. Number one is I've been quite pleasantly surprised in the work we've been doing in this particular segment. I've been pleasantly surprised at the attitude of specifiers and end users towards cost. Be more cost effective than buying a new light fitting. That's generally hasn't been the case. There's been a kind of a baseline of as long as it's not more expensive than buying a new fitting, but without doubt there has to be, within that entire supply chain, a general shift in attitude towards embracing circularity and just looking beyond capital cost, and that's going to take some time for that to become a regular thing.
People have got a corporate policy, for instance, that might say they need to do these things, but equally some companies might not want to be seen by their competitors or whatever to make waste, and that perhaps is going to be an increasingly noticeable issue.
Actually, there's an interesting, I was going to say, there's an interesting parallel in the IT sector. I mean, at Recolight, we now have a policy of buying refurbished second-hand IT from the original manufacturer. The cost saving is only 5%. So we get original manufacturers sort of upgraded product. It's 5% cheaper than the new, but for us, we're fine to do that because actually we have a policy of saying we're going to buy reused where possible. So, if we can get that type of policy built into more end users, I think the price becomes less of an issue.
It's a culture change, isn't it? I just want to take a comment from Sauro Stacchiotti. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. He's applauding the idea of developing a collective system between producers, Recolight, and remanufacturers, because he says circularity is a collective and collaborative system. It's not sustainable. Imagine each manufacturer retaking its own old products, whereas those products could have value for someone else. In this way, we can reduce environmental impact and support innovation. He also says we need to pay attention to the electronics innovation. When you remanufacture, maybe the old drivers are not available. The new ones are not coherent in performance and quality with safety standards with the old body and materials. And he also asked about, what branding goes onto these products at the end. Do remanufacturers put their own brand on those products? So anybody want to take any of those comments?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, I think this is an apology that it wasn't clear enough in my presentation. So in the 887 committee, Simon's smiling because we've debated this to no end. It's actually very clear, and we're trying to cut down on the grey areas. So the remanufacturer, when they place the product back onto the market, they take unequivocal legislative responsibility for that product. And of course, that means a new declaration of conformity, a new UKCA mark, a label with all of the usual ratings and addresses and everything that you'd expect for a new product. So yes, that's unequivocal. We obviously recognize that perhaps particularly older products or products which have the OEM's identification may be built into the luminaire, so through pressings or castings, or even if it's part of the sort of aesthetic, the heritage of the product, it's not desirable or practical to remove those. it's really down to a risk assessment of making sure that it's clear to the end user that the new labeling is in fact the active labeling. So obviously we don't want warranty claims on a remanufactured product going back to the OEM, who of course has got nothing to do with the product in its current incarnation.
Tom, you put an egg lighting label,
yeah,
and on a thorn fitting, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
And you'll put a QR code on. Okay, right.
Yeah, and we also, like I sort of alluded to on the compliance testing, we put our own unique identifier code and QR code on that as well. So the idea is that we've got a complete record of batch testing and test records as well.
And Kevin's couple of examples with projects, because it kind of highlights, the thing we're kind of trying to capture in BS 8887 is how you identify on a project by project basis the scope of works that is applicable to the remanufacturing process on a project by project basis, because that it will inherently differ now as you go to every single site, and it's important that there's enough flexibility in BS 8887 to acknowledge that 5 fittings that get refurbished in an underpass is different from 3,000 fittings that get refurbished on a 30-story tower block.
Sorry, go on, Ray.
I was going to say, Henry Elabrat is saying if there are tax incentives attached, then there could be a higher intake of repaired and reused lighting. I presume you agree with that, Nigel.
Would indeed, and obviously getting tax incentives out of the Treasury is very challenging, particularly at the moment. But yeah, so I was going to ask the rest of the panel in which situations they see it would be possible to remanufacture on site rather than bringing the product back to a factory, reworking it and then delivering it again.
Can I start there? That is quite possible. In fact, we already have been doing that for a number of years. But you have to just look at each project, the product, the risk of handling it and moving it, the RAMs for the site, the risk assessment method statements that get agreed, access, when you can work, all those things are all just another bit of the equation. But some things can easily be done on site, but keeping things so that they are easily and efficiently changed is also key to it, and that's down to the design of what you do. And this is where we come to a lot of luminaires in the past had been designed to be repairable, and if we take the example of say a flat panel LED luminaire now, that's about as far non-repairable as you can get by comparison, but it is easily removable on site. So the trouble is it's not going to get properly recycled.
Jürgen Oser is saying that light is the beauty of architecture. I don't think we disagree with that. Will the circular economy lead to a standardization of lighting to simplify the handling, but also the loss of individual design freedom and lighting? I would have given that to Emilio, but I'm going to put it to you, Simon, that if we're going to have all these demountable fittings with screws now, I mean, are we going to, and less integration into the architecture, are we going to lose something in beauty?
It's a conflict that I deal with as a product designer on a day-to-day basis, right? Because it's very easy to look at a new product scope and say, right, I'm going to use a Zaga footprint LED board, a standard driver, and then the question from the client comes, well, where's my differentiation, or where's my unique selling feature? And actually, as a product designer, I want to create something that's beautiful and unique and desirable and award-winning, whatever. So there is a conflict around those two things. But I really believe that actually collectively, not just me, but if we're collectively doing our jobs properly, then beauty can derive out of modularity. There's no those two. It isn't either or. Those two can go hand in hand.
And you can design in features around that particular product or around the equipment you're using if you want to, and architects have been putting their stamp on luminaires and even ceilings in offices and things like that, just on a regular basis on all the major projects, and that probably will still continue. But you can be really quite flexible, and it's just about thinking outside the box or choosing what you want rather than letting someone choose it for you.
I think just to build on that as well, some of the examples that Kevin gave there, and maybe even, if you refer to Skinflint, some of the lighting upgrades that they've done, are incredibly creative, very inspiring from a design perspective, and kind of undeniably beautiful. So remanufacture and circular economy can be a force for inspiring design. And from a philosophical standpoint, I think there's something from a design perspective very interesting about reusing components. It adds constraint, and from constraint stems creativity.
You only have to look at, for instance, industrial style products being reused across everywhere. That's just a classic case of things being repurposed, and that can happen to all sorts of things.
It's a fashion, isn't it? Kevin, I noticed you use a gear tray that you does that count as remanufacturing? Where does the line between remanufacturing and sort of changing components?
Well, obviously you can take back what's already there, but if what's already there was at risk of catching fire and causing electrical fire, then it's not a good idea to reuse it. So in that case, making a gear tray meant everything could come as near factory tested as possible to site to convert what was already existing with minimum works, with minimum risk, without having to demount the luminaires, and that was all part of the brief. It also meant we've greatly improved the efficiency. And one of the things that happens with the fact we've got LEDs, we also seem to have got free plastics into every job as well. And they've been replacing, shall we say, reflector luminaires that replaced before that plastic luminaires. A reflector luminaire, you might be able to reuse the reflector in part of your design. So you're changing less. Whereas if it's a plastic optic, that might have degraded, or it might be all sandwiched up and you can't take it apart. So, and like Nigel said, it might not be as recyclable either. So there's lots of elements there.
And there's another element of BS 887 that's worth pointing out here, is that kind of it's easy to fall into the de facto position where remanufacturing equals improved efficacy, right, above everything else. Mm-hmm. And that's simply not the case. And part of it's quite a big debate around 887 is BS 887 is actually identifying the correct kind of response to an application need, particularly if you're talking about taking a fitting from one location ultimately and putting it somewhere else, effectively reusing it. Mm-hmm. Then the application, it's important to understand the application it goes into and provide a fixture that either performs or is adequate for the new application it's intended for.
But when does 887 kick in? I mean, if you rewire a fluorescent fitting for a lead tube, does that count? Do you have to do the testing again?
Anything that materially changes the original product sort of falls under this the bracket of remanufacture. I mean, Tom, you might want to say a few words about that because you've got greater experience.
Well, I mean, I think we're probably not at a point to say with authority until that standard is published, is the first thing to say. And it's not one single check is, hold up to the glass, is it remanufacture? Mm-hmm. But I think it's a collection of things. It's about a circular economy principle being present, reused components being present, but also a diligent engineering and testing process being present. So what we're very keen as an industry to define within remanufacture is that it's not a question of maybe, I've got these drivers and I've sort of wired it in here and the light is coming out, we'll screw that back on. I'm talking generally, but that's not remanufacture.
Mm-hmm. And it's worth at this point just kind of, okay, we've talked around the British standard BS 887. There are at European level there are other standards and regulations that are presently being developed or enhanced. One that jumps to mind is EN 4555, which defines kind of more at a European level, or stepping back at a European level, circularity in particular of light fittings, but it does include the principle of reuse, the principle of repairability, the principle of remanufacture, and the principle of recycling. So I know we have an international audience on, so it's just stepping back and taking a kind of a wider European view. There are other things that that we consider that we cover off in the workshop.
Indeed, a good point to put that. We have come to the 12:30. So yes, the workshop's coming up. We one next week. Is there any spare places on that, Simon?
I think it's fully booked.
Oh, okay. Well, I shouldn't be. Well, I'll be there. And I'm looking forward to that.
No, but we are talking about future dates. I think
October and November.
Space. Yeah.
So they'll be on recolight.co.uk website. So our next outing is Circular Lighting Live on September the 22nd, and then we have a webinar on projects and how a project can be truly circular, and we will have that on the 20th of October. All the details on recolight.co.uk. I'd like to say thank you to all our speakers, including Emilio, who's left us, Nigel, Kevin, Tom, and Simon and Suzanne for helping in the background. Thank you for your comments, your questions. Thank you for joining us today. You will get an email and you will be able to review this at your leisure. So keep an eye out for that email. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Ray, for hosting us in such an effective way. Thank you.
Thank you.
To Suzanne for being in the engine room as well.